Thanks to a failure in leadership, an aggressive push toward renewable energy, and drastically reducing production of traditional energy, the world is currently experiencing skyrocketing energy prices, which will most likely lead to an energy crisis. The consequences will be devastating to the economy and our push to decrease carbon emissions, and this will reverberate for years. And worst of all, the damage will be, by and large, be felt by those least prepared, the bottom third of the economic ladder. We are now starting to see the effects of decisions made years ago. In 2021, due to unfavorable conditions for renewable energy sources such as less wind than expected, a lot of countries had to rely on natural gas to pick up the slack from renewable energy. And due to not having sufficient stockpiles of the commodity, natural gas prices exploded due to the surge in demand to meet their energy crunch. There is limited supply of natural gas capacity since it needs specialized infrastructure to transport it. This means there's a finite amount that can be loaded onto ships and moved between trapped markets. Because of this, you can't just flip a switch if you suddenly need a boost of natural gas. And this is why natural gas costs $380 per million BTU in the US, being readily available due to the shale industry there, while simultaneously costing over $30 per million BTU in the EU and in Asia. And while it's not a perfect comparison, at its peak, natural gas reached a price of $60 per million BTU, which is an equivalent of $350 per barrel of oil. After a decade of oil majors divesting from oil, cutting down on investment and capital expenditure, and refocusing on the renewable energy sources, we're currently experiencing a 5-year low in oil supply. This while oil prices have already hit pre-COVID levels, while demand is still deflated due to COVID. Still, the hostile regulatory environment has discouraged many companies to willingly invest in exploration and development. And many countries stand to introduce a tax on so-called windfall profits for these companies certainly doesn't help. US shale producers, for instance, have by and large started focusing on cash flows to shareholders rather than investing in new production. And it's not just the West's oil reserves that are looking bleak. OPEC Plus, which is generally regarded as the world's spare capacity, can't meet their own quotas and is at their lowest since 2008, which in itself is a 30-year low. Our supply crunch doesn't help by the potential unrest caused by high energy prices either. Look what's happened in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan produces 1.5 million barrels of oil a day and is an important source for Europe. This sounds like a lot of oil, but currently the world uses roughly 100 million barrels of oil a day. And this is pretty unevenly distributed, with 12 barrels of oil per person a year in developed countries and roughly 3 barrels per person per year in developing countries. And contrary to popular belief, oil demand is growing by roughly 1% a year, and demand might very well accelerate going forward. Developing countries are expected to add 2 billion to their population in the next 20 or 30 years, while simultaneously lifting millions into the middle class. And the middle class consumes more to achieve a higher quality of life. Even if they don't reach the demand that we have in the West, but just consume 1 or 2 barrels more per person per year, we can easily see the demand for oil double in the coming decades. This while having an average decline rate for oil of roughly 5 to 7% a year, with low investment to discover new oil. If we continue on the path we're on today, by 2040 we will only have roughly 20 million barrels a day available. That's 1/5 of what we need today, and more like 1/10 of what we're gonna need in the future. It's easy to forget, but oil is not only used for transportation, it's used for chemicals, plastics, and synthetic material that permeate our everyday lives. Both the EU and the US has been systematically and indiscriminately shutting down nuclear power for years. As recently as December 31st, 2021, Germany took 3 nuclear power plants offline, which is a critical amount of power. California has decided to take down its last remaining nuclear facilities in Diablo Canyon, which provide 8% of California's energy needs and 10% of its energy production. Since California doesn't produce enough energy internally, they're currently stuck importing 20 to 25% of their energy needs. Like oil, uranium suffered from chronic underinvestment during the last decade, leading to a collapse in production and exploration. And this is also not helped by the aforementioned unrest in Kazakhstan, which supplies 40 to 45% of the world's uranium. Not only did Germany take a critical amount of power offline, they took a critical amount of baseload power offline. And not only did California shut down 8% of their energy needs, but 20% of their baseload power, with no credible plan to replace it. It seems like our policymakers do not understand the difference between intermittent power and baseload power, or they simply do not care. In simple terms, the power grid is just a transportation system for electrons. This grid is a centralized network that moves electricity from the power plant to your home. To keep electricity flowing, the grid needs a steady flow of electrons. And this is where baseload power and intermittent power comes into play. Baseload power, which is produced by coal, natural gas, and nuclear power, can provide a steady flow of electrons 24/7. Intermittent power, such as wind and solar, is irregular and production will fluctuate based on when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing. When intermittent power fluctuates, utilities need to adjust electric output to keep the grid stable. The flow of electricity needs to remain steady or the whole system can go down, causing blackouts. And if you remove the baseload and replace it with intermittent power, then the grid becomes destabilized. And what's currently happening is that policymakers are subsidizing intermittent power while tightening regulation and dismantling baseload power. Most politicians point toward batteries and other types of storage, which is a rapidly developing area, but the technology is not yet advanced enough to warrant such aggressive dismantling. Sooner or later, we'll have to move over to renewables, right? So why not just take the pain now to increase the speed of innovation and change? Well, it doesn't take much in inelastic commodity markets to make prices spike drastically. By crippling our energy supply, we're making energy a lot more expensive. And that doesn't just mean it will be more expensive to drive your car or heat your home. Everything gets more expensive when the price of energy rises, since everything requires energy to be produced. That includes everything from clothes to food. It's inflation caused by energy shortages. And the worst part is, we'll mostly be okay. Most people in the developed world can handle rising food costs, although they might not be as well off. Those that will be affected the most are those that can't afford it, people who are already struggling. And not only are we depriving these people of necessities to survive, but also robbing them of their chance for a better standard of living. Germany has spent over 100 million euros on renewables during the last decade and plans to spend another 400 million euros by 2040. Germany currently has the highest energy prices in all of Europe, and most importantly, they aren't even leading the EU in carbon emission reduction, because they have to rely on dirty fossil fuels like coal when their intermittent sources aren't producing enough power. A more pragmatic solution would be to systematically replace coal with natural gas and build out nuclear alongside a rollout of renewables. That would sharply decrease our current carbon emissions while allowing for cheap and reliable energy, which will also allow the economy to keep growing. It's a win-win. The world will benefit immensely from growing everyone's standard of living. But why nuclear? Nuclear is the only carbon-free baseload power, and is frankly an excellent way to decarbonize the economy. If we want to solve the climate crisis, we have a very good solution. And the barrier for nuclear isn't technical, but political. In a realistic world, where you want to decrease carbon emissions, you can't oppose natural gas to replace coal, and you can't oppose nuclear to replace natural gas. When we finally solve an efficient way to reduce carbon emissions in the West, what we need to do is find smart ways to incentivize others to do it as well. There's a reason why many industries do not want further environmental regulation. It's because they get absolutely slaughtered on an international arena when they have to compete with companies in countries that do not have the same stringent regulation. Currently, what we're doing is imposing extremely strict regulation in the West while not upholding our trading partners like China to the same standards. If you have to compete with a company who is allowed to use the dirtiest and cheapest energy sources like coal, they're allowed to dump their waste in nearby rivers and so forth, while you have to follow strict guidelines for emissions, waste management, and so on, it will be impossible for you to compete with them, since they will be able to produce items a lot cheaper and run you out of business. We've seen this happen countless of times during the last decades, where several industries have been handed over for free to China and other economies because we won't make them follow the same rules as us. The US used to dominate magnesium production, but while the US were imposing stricter environmental regulation, they also allowed magnesium trade with China, who heavily subsidizes their magnesium production and use cheap and dirty electricity, coal, to flood the world with low-cost magnesium. This resulted in the implosion of the US magnesium industry, and China now makes up 85% of the world's magnesium production. And this has ripple effects across many industries because magnesium is an incredibly important commodity that is needed to make critical alloys for things like the automotive and aerospace industries. And magnesium isn't the only industry that this has happened to. It's happened to several industries. It's happened to the polysilicon industry, which is crucial for solar power. When we're so dependent on one country, we're also at their mercy. We saw this during 2021 when China throttled energy-intensive industries for export while still making sure they had enough for domestic use. The solution is substantial tariffs on trade with countries that don't follow their West's stringent regulation, so our own industries don't go under. Unfettered capitalism is most likely not the way. Left to its own devices, industry will without a doubt pollute more. Just look at countries with less stringent laws than the EU and US. It's just a lot cheaper to compete without these environmental guards. Some major investors have recently taken notice. In the last 2 years, BlackRock has done a complete 180 on their stance on fossil fuels. From advocating shareholders to redirect capital from fossil fuel development, in the name of climate change, to completely backtracking 2 years later. Why? Most likely an asset manager with $9.5 trillion under management has a hard time justifying runaway energy prices as a catalyst for scarcity, inflation, and shortages, while also by effect making Western and industrialized economies cede geopolitical and economic power to Russia and Middle Eastern countries as those economies gain influence when energy supply dwindles. When energy prices climb, scapegoats will be made. There will be finger pointing and politicians will find someone to assign the blame. And it won't be themselves. First will no doubt be the oil and energy companies for generating so-called windfall profits amid shortages. Then most likely they will set their sights on Wall Street. However, if we want to maintain any semblance of our current society, capital must flow back into the energy sector. Dangerous policy proposals made by policymakers have led to disastrous outcomes which will reverberate for years. In the end, you can avoid reality, but you can't avoid the consequences of avoiding reality.